Max's paws ached as he trudged along the frozen streets, his breath forming delicate clouds in the crisp air. His stomach churned with hunger, but survival had taught him to focus on one thing at a time. Tonight, his priority was simple: find a safe place to rest. As he turned into an alley, a dull glow from a streetlight revealed a dumpster overflowing with discarded food. With cautious steps, Max drew closer, his nose twitching at the scent of half-eaten sandwiches and scraps. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry him through another day. Unbeknownst to Max, his scavenging hadn't gone unnoticed. An older man named Joe, wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, watched the dog from the shadows of his small convenience store. Joe had lived in this town for years and had seen plenty of strays, but there was something different about Max. The dog moved with a quiet dignity, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings as if danger could strike at any moment. Joe had a soft spot for animals, especially those who'd known suffering. He grabbed a leftover roast chicken from his counter, stepped outside, and called softly, "Hey there, buddy. You hungry?" Max froze, every instinct telling him to flee, but the kindness in Joe's voice softened the edge of his caution. The dog turned his head slightly, his ears perking up, his tail giving the faintest of wags. Encouraged, Joe crouched, placing the chicken on the ground before backing away to give Max space. Slowly, Max approached, his nose quivering as he sniffed the food. Within moments, he was devouring it, though his wary eyes flicked up to Joe after every few bites. Over the following days, a tentative trust blossomed between the man and the dog. Joe began leaving food outside his shop at the same time each evening, and Max learned to trust the quiet man who never rushed him or raised his voice. Though Max remained elusive, refusing any contact, he started staying longer after each meal, sitting a few feet away as Joe spoke to him in a soft, calming tone. One evening, as Max finished his food, he surprised both himself and Joe by taking a cautious step forward. Joe held his breath, stilling his movements. Max sniffed the air, his dark eyes meeting Joe's for a brief moment. Then, as if testing the waters, he pressed his nose gently against Joe's outstretched hand. It was a small gesture, but it marked a significant shift in their relationship. Joe, a widower with no children, found unexpected comfort in Max's quiet presence. He began setting up a small bed of blankets behind his shop, hoping Max would take shelter there during cold nights. Little by little, Max began to accept Joe's care. For the first time in years, he found warmth, not just physically, but emotionally. Joe often wondered about Max's past. The dog's scars, both visible and hidden, spoke of hardship, but Joe respected his new companion's silence. He never pushed for affection, never tried to control him. Instead, he offered steady kindness, giving Max the time and space to heal at his own pace. As the months passed, Max's coat grew shinier, and the dullness in his eyes began to fade. He started joining Joe on his daily walks to the edge of town, where children playing in the snow would occasionally wave at the pair. Max still flinched at sudden movements, but his confidence was returning slowly. The bond between man and dog deepened, built on mutual trust and a shared understanding of loneliness. Then, one crisp spring morning, something unusual occurred. As Joe and Max walked their usual route, Max stopped abruptly, his ears erect, his nose twitching. His body tensed, and he stared down the road. Joe followed his gaze and saw a man approaching, a man who seemed vaguely familiar. Max's tail, which had been wagging moments earlier, stiffened. A low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound Joe had never heard before. The man moving toward them appeared disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes darting around nervously. Joe instinctively moved closer to Max, resting a protective hand on his head. The man's eyes landed on Max, and he froze. "Max!" the man called out, his voice filled with disbelief. Max stiffened under Joe's touch, his growl growing louder. Joe immediately realized who this man must be: Max's former owner. The man took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab Max, but the dog wasn't the same frightened creature who had fled 2 years ago. With a sharp bark, Max lunged forward, placing himself between Joe and the stranger. The cold winter air sliced through the desolate streets of the small rural town as dusk began to cast its shadows. A lone dog limped cautiously along the road, his fur matted, his eyes filled with a weight beyond his years. This was Max, a scruffy mutt who had endured more in his short life than most animals should ever have to. Once a beloved pet, Max had known the warmth of a family, the comfort of a gentle hand. But those memories had faded, replaced by the scars of cruelty and neglect. 2 years earlier, Max's owner had been a man named Alan. Once kind-hearted, Alan's demeanor soured after losing his job. With no outlet for his frustration, Alan's anger turned toward Max. The dog bore the brunt of his outbursts, harsh words, kicks, and even days without food. Max's bright eyes dulled, his tail no longer wagged. But despite the abuse, something inside him never fully broke. A flicker of loyalty and love still burned deep within. One fateful night, after a particularly violent outburst, Max found the courage to escape. With the cold wind at his back, he ran as fast as his legs would carry him, leaving behind the only home he had ever known. For days, Max wandered aimlessly, scavenging for scraps, finding shelter under bridges. The scars on his body told a story of pain, but his eyes still carried a glimmer of hope. Little did Max know, fate had other plans. Plans that would bring him to a kind-hearted stranger who would change his life forever. But the most incredible part of his story was yet to come, an event 2 years in the making that would shock everyone who doubted him. The police arrived at Joe's shop, their flashlights slicing through the dim interior. Joe recounted the incident with steady composure, though the adrenaline still rushed through his veins. Max sat at his side, his eyes locked on the door, as if waiting for Alan to return. The officers reassured Joe they would keep an eye on the area, but their words did little to ease his concern. Once they left, Joe locked the door and knelt beside Max, gently stroking the dog's head. "It's over, buddy," he whispered, though doubt lingered in his heart. Max leaned into the touch, his usual wariness giving way to a rare moment of vulnerability. The next day, Joe decided to take action. He called a friend, Karen, who worked at an animal shelter in a nearby town. Joe knew Karen was a seasoned animal advocate and could offer guidance on how to keep Max safe. After hearing the story, Karen didn't hesitate. "You need to get Max microchipped and registered under your name," she advised. "That way, if Alan tries anything, you'll have legal proof that Max belongs to you." Joe agreed and made the appointment at the shelter. The process was simple, and Karen even offered to file a report documenting the encounter with Alan. When she scanned Max's microchip, a strange look passed across her face. "What is it?" Joe asked, his stomach tightening. Karen hesitated before answering. "Max already has a microchip. It was registered to someone 2 years ago. Alan Thompson." Joe felt a cold knot form in his chest. "What does that mean? Does this give him a claim to Max?" Karen sighed. "Not necessarily. Laws vary by state, and in cases of neglect or abuse, the courts usually favor the current caregiver, especially if the animal is well cared for. But this complicates things. Alan could make a case." The news left Joe uneasy. He had worked so hard to give Max a safe, loving home, and the thought of Alan interfering with that was unbearable. But Karen's next words offered a flicker of hope. "I'll contact a lawyer who specializes in animal custody cases," she assured him. "We'll make sure Max's history is documented. If it comes to a legal battle, we'll be prepared." Feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety, Joe thanked Karen and took Max home. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles weren't over. Max, sensing Joe's unease, rested his head on the man's lap, his soft eyes filled with unwavering trust. One crisp autumn morning, Joe received an unexpected letter in his mailbox. The envelope, plain and unremarkable, carried a return address that made his heart drop: a law firm. His hand shook as he opened the letter and read its contents. It was a formal notice from Alan's attorney, demanding the return of Max, claiming the dog as Alan's property. The letter was filled with falsehoods, portraying Alan as a victim of circumstances, a man who had lost his beloved dog due to unavoidable misfortune. There was no mention of the abuse, the scars, both physical and emotional, that had shaped Max into the dog he was now. Joe's stomach churned, but he didn't waste time feeling helpless. He picked up the phone immediately and dialed Karen's number. "Joe, I was expecting this," she said, her voice steady. "Don't worry. We've got everything documented. We'll fight this." The situation quickly escalated. Alan filed a legal complaint, and within days, Joe found a court summons on his doorstep. The thought of standing before a judge and fighting for Max's future felt overwhelming. But as he looked at Max, sleeping peacefully on the rug, unaware of the storm brewing around them, Joe knew there was no turning back. Max was no longer just a pet. He was family. Sitting at the kitchen table, the court summons in front of him, Joe's mind swirled with emotions: anger, fear, and an unyielding determination. Across the room, Max lay on his bed, blissfully unaware. Joe ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. "We're not losing this, Max," he muttered under his breath, though it was as much for himself as it was for the dog. "I won't let it happen." That evening, Joe met with Karen and the lawyer she'd recommended, Rachel Collins. A sharp and empathetic attorney with years of experience in animal custody cases, Rachel quickly put Joe at ease. "The courts prioritize the welfare of the animal," she said. "If we can prove neglect and abuse, Alan doesn't stand a chance." Rachel laid out a clear strategy. They would focus on Max's recovery under Joe's care, showcasing his physical transformation, and present testimonies from witnesses who could speak to the abuse Alan had inflicted. Karen had already gathered statements from neighbors and shelter workers who had seen Max in his earlier broken state. Frightened and malnourished, his body a map of pain. For weeks, Joe threw himself into preparing for the case. He compiled photos of Max's journey from a timid stray to a strong and healthy dog. He and Karen worked together to gather veterinary records detailing Max's injuries and recovery, solid proof of the cruelty he'd endured. Despite the pressure mounting around him, Joe tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He and Max kept up their daily walks, though Joe remained vigilant, always watching for any sign of Alan. Max, sensing his companion's unease, often paused mid-step to nudge Joe's hand or wag his tail in silent reassurance. It was as though Max was saying, "Don't worry, we've got this." One evening, as Joe pored over court documents in the living room, a knock at the door startled him. His heart skipped a beat. Was it Alan, finally making a move? But when Joe opened the door, he found a young woman in her 20s, holding a stack of papers. "Hi, are you Joe?" she asked hesitantly. "I'm Emily. I'm Alan's niece." Joe eyed her warily. "What do you want?" Emily shifted nervously but met Joe's gaze. "I know about the case. I wanted to help. Alan's my uncle, but I know what he did to Max. He doesn't deserve to get him back." Joe blinked in surprise, then let his guard drop slightly. "Why are you telling me this? Why go against your own family?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "Because Max doesn't deserve that life," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to stop my uncle, but he never listened. When Max ran away, I prayed he'd find a better life, and I think he has." She handed Joe the stack of papers. "These are statements from neighbors who saw the abuse. And there's a video too. I'm not sure if it'll be enough, but I wanted to give you something to help." Joe took the papers, his hands shaking. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Emily gave him a faint smile. "Take care of him," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. That night, Joe and Rachel watched the video Emily had provided. It showed Alan dragging Max by the collar, shouting obscenities while the dog shrank in fear. Rachel's face hardened as she watched. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, her voice low. "It's irrefutable proof of neglect." The day of the court hearing arrived faster than Joe had anticipated. As he and Rachel walked into the courthouse, Joe felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. He glanced down at Max, who trotted beside him, his leash held loosely in Joe's hand. "We've got this, buddy," Joe whispered, trying to steady himself with the dog's calm presence. Inside the courtroom, Alan sat with his lawyer, his posture stiff and defensive. Alan avoided Joe's gaze, his face a mixture of defiance and discomfort. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, called the court to order and motioned for Rachel to begin. Rachel spoke with unwavering confidence, presenting the evidence, veterinary records, witness statements, and the video from Emily. Every piece of evidence painted a damning portrait of Alan's treatment of Max. When Alan's turn came, he tried to deflect blame, claiming that his actions were out of frustration and that he had always cared for Max. But his arguments crumbled under the weight of the overwhelming evidence. Even his own niece Emily took the stand, recounting the abuse she had witnessed and her efforts to intervene. The judge remained impassive as she listened, her expression unreadable. After both sides had presented their cases, she called for a short recess before delivering her verdict. Joe and Max sat in the hallway, both waiting in silence. Joe's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Max, but as he gazed down at the dog, who looked up at him with unspoken trust, a surge of hope filled him. No matter what happened next, Joe had done everything he could to protect Max. The courtroom was quiet as everyone filed back in. Joe's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Max sat at his feet, calm as ever, a sharp contrast to the tension filling the room. The judge adjusted her glasses and, in a voice that was both firm and calm, began, "It is clear from the evidence presented, veterinary records, witness testimony, and video footage, that Mr. Alan Thompson has subjected Max to a pattern of neglect and abuse. Therefore, I hereby rule that Mr. Joseph Carter is the rightful and legal owner of Max. This court finds no merit in Mr. Thompson's claim." Relief flooded Joe as the judge's words sank in. He reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, whispering, "We did it, buddy." Across the room, Alan's face twisted in rage. He stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "This isn't over," he shouted, pointing a finger at Joe. "You'll regret this." The judge slammed her gavel. "Mr. Thompson, I suggest you leave this courtroom quietly. Any further outbursts will result in contempt charges." Alan, now seething with anger, stormed out of the room. His lawyer urged him to calm down, but Alan shoved him off and left in a fit of fury. Rachel leaned in close to Joe. "We've won this round, but be careful," she cautioned. "People like him don't just give up." Joe nodded, his joy tempered by the lingering threat. He knew Alan wouldn't walk away quietly, but he was ready for whatever came next. Max nuzzled his hand, as if to reassure him. "We can handle it," Joe whispered, looking down at the dog. "Together, we'll handle it." And so, with that, Joe and Max left the courthouse, a man and his dog, finally free to move on, their bond unbreakable, their past behind them. The weight of the legal battle had been lifted, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Joe, however, struggled to release the lingering resentment. Over the next few days, he tried to return to a sense of normalcy, resuming his walks with Max. They wandered farther from town, exploring new trails that offered them a quiet respite from the tension that had haunted Joe's life. The court ruling had provided a sense of security, but Alan's parting words still echoed in his mind, keeping him on edge. One evening, while closing up shop, Joe noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. The driver sat motionless, watching the building. A chill ran down Joe's spine. Is it Alan? Or someone he sent? His heart raced, but he resisted the urge to call the police, deciding to wait and see if the car would leave on its own. Hours passed, and as night fell, the car finally drove off, but the unease lingered. Joe shared his concerns with Karen, who immediately suggested contacting the local police. "They need to be aware of this," she insisted. "If Alan's harassing you, they can step in." Joe filed a report, and the police promised to patrol the area more frequently, but the situation continued to weigh heavily on him. He found himself double-checking the locks on the doors and glancing over his shoulder whenever he left the shop. Max, sensing Joe's anxiety, became increasingly protective, barking at unfamiliar noises and staying close whenever they were outside. Though Max's vigilance was comforting, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that their lives would never truly be free of Alan's shadow. Then, one night, as Joe was closing the shop, he heard something in the alley behind the building. At first, it was faint, a shuffle of feet, the metallic clatter of something being knocked over. Max growled low in his throat, his ears perked. Joe grabbed a flashlight, stepping outside cautiously, with Max by his side. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing at first. But just as Joe was about to turn back, a figure darted behind a dumpster. "Who's there?" Joe called, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. There was no response, but Max lunged forward, barking furiously. Joe tightened his grip on the leash, trying to keep the dog at bay. "Show yourself," Joe demanded, his voice unwavering. Slowly, a teenager emerged from behind the dumpster, his hands raised in surrender. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, his clothes ragged and his face pale from hunger. "I wasn't doing anything," the boy stammered. Joe lowered the flashlight, but he didn't relax his guard. "What are you doing back here?" The boy hesitated before muttering, "I was just looking for food." Joe's suspicion softened. The boy's gaunt frame and nervous demeanor spoke of hardship. "Are you homeless?" Joe asked gently. The boy nodded, glancing at Max warily, who had stopped barking but remained alert. Joe sighed, his voice kind. "Come inside. I'll get you something to eat." The boy followed him into the shop, and Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't purely a coincidence. Was the boy just hungry, or had he been sent by Alan to spy on him? Either way, Joe couldn't turn him away. He prepared a plate of food, watching as the boy devoured it in silence. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to scare you." Joe nodded but kept his questions to himself, for now. The mystery of the boy's sudden appearance deepened, and the unsettling feeling in Joe's gut grew stronger. Had Alan found another way to get to him? The next morning, Joe found Evan sitting cross-legged on the floor, Max lying beside him. The dog's tail thumped against the wooden floor as Evan scratched behind his ears. It was rare to see Max so at ease around strangers. "You're good with him," Joe remarked, breaking the silence. Evan smiled faintly. "He's a good dog. He deserves to be treated right." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Joe, sensing a deeper truth, decided it was time for answers. "Evan, why were you really in that alley last night?" Joe asked, his tone gentle but firm. The boy's expression shifted, guilt flashing across his face. "I told you," he muttered quickly. "I was looking for food." Joe crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "I believe you needed food, but there's more to it, isn't there?" Evan hesitated, eyes flicking nervously toward the door. After a long pause, he sighed, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Okay, fine. I heard about you and Max. Some guys. They've been talking, saying Alan wants the dog back. I thought if I could warn you, maybe you'd help me." Joe's heart sank. "Alan sent you?" The boy's response was immediate, his voice sharp with panic. "I'd never help him. He's a monster. I've seen what he's done to Max, to other dogs. That's why I left. I couldn't be part of it anymore." Joe studied Evan, his gut telling him the boy was telling the truth. There was a rawness in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. Determination. "You worked with him?" Joe asked quietly. Evan nodded, a deep shame coloring his cheeks. "Not by choice. My brother, he owed Alan money. A lot of money. When he couldn't pay, Alan made me work for him. I didn't have a choice." Joe's chest tightened, not with anger at Evan, but at Alan. The man's cruelty seemed boundless. "What did he make you do?" Joe asked, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Anything he needed," Evan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Setting up fights, cleaning up after them, helping with the dogs. I hated it. I tried to leave, but Alan said he'd hurt my brother if I did." Joe's anger flared, his hands clenching into fists. "And now?" "I ran," Evan said simply, a look of resolve in his eyes. "I couldn't take it anymore. But I think he's looking for me. That's why I was hiding in the alley." Joe leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Evan was telling the truth, he wasn't just a frightened kid. He could be a valuable ally in the fight against Alan. "You know where Alan keeps the dogs?" Joe asked carefully, his voice low with intent. Evan nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, it's bad though, real bad." Joe exchanged a glance with Max. The dog's steady gaze gave him a strange sense of courage. He felt an unspoken understanding between them, a bond that ran deeper than words. "If we're going to stop him, I need your help," Joe said, his voice low but firm. Evan's eyes widened. "Stop him? You mean turn him in?" Joe nodded, his resolve hardening. "With what you know, we can expose him. We can make sure he never hurts another dog or person again." Evan hesitated, fear flashing across his face. "What if he finds out? What if he comes after me? Or you?" Joe placed a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll be careful, and we'll have the law on our side. Alan's time is running out." Evan took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he processed Joe's words. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay, I'll help. But you have to promise. If anything happens, you'll look out for my brother." Joe met his gaze, unwavering. "For you, I have my word." They began to plan their next steps, knowing the stakes had just been raised. Max, ever the silent sentinel, watched them closely, his presence a steady reminder of why they were fighting. The path ahead would be perilous, but for the first time Joe felt the faintest glimmer of hope. "But Joe, you need to be careful," Evan's voice broke through his thoughts. "If Alan finds out what you've done, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Joe glanced over at Evan, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. "I know. We'll lay low for now," Joe replied, his voice tight with worry. After ending the call, Joe pulled into the shop's driveway and turned off the engine. The quiet of the night settled around them like a blanket, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just narrowly escaped. Inside, Joe set up his laptop, ready to upload the photos they'd gathered, while Evan busied himself feeding Max. The dog wagged his tail with enthusiasm, a bright reminder of the mission they were all bound to. As the images transferred, Joe couldn't help but notice the tension in Evan's posture, his shoulders drawn tight. "Hey," Joe said gently, trying to ease the palpable strain between them. "You did great tonight." Evan shrugged, his expression guarded. "I just hope it's enough. Alan, he's not the kind of guy who gives up easily." Joe reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. "It's enough. And if he comes for us, we'll be ready." But sleep, for Joe, was elusive. Every creak of the shop, every rustle of wind outside felt like a warning. The feeling gnawed at him, a constant reminder that Alan was still out there, likely planning his next move. Max, sensing Joe's unease, stayed close, his head resting in Joe's lap as they sat in the dimly lit room, a quiet sentry in the night. The next morning, the evidence was delivered to Rachel, who immediately contacted the authorities. "They're reviewing it now," she informed Joe over the phone. "If all goes well, they'll raid Alan's operation within the week." Joe's breath caught in his chest. It was a relief, but it brought new challenges too. As long as Alan was free, they were still in danger. Joe decided to keep Evan at the shop, unwilling to risk the boy being found alone. It wasn't just about the photos anymore, it was about survival. As the days passed, a bond began to form between Joe and Evan, strengthened by their shared purpose. They worked together to care for Max and maintain the shop. The rhythm of daily life, the small acts of normalcy, provided them with a sense of control in a world that felt out of balance. Through it all, Joe learned more about Evan's past, his love for animals, his dream of becoming a veterinarian before Alan's shadow fell over his life. "You'd make a great vet," Joe said one evening as they cleaned the shop. "You've got the heart for it." Evan smiled faintly, the first real smile Joe had seen in days. It was like a light flickering back to life. "Maybe someday, if we get through this." Joe nodded. "We will. And when we do, you'll have a fresh start." Max, ever loyal, seemed to adopt Evan as part of his pack. The dog, who had once been wary of strangers, now followed Evan around the shop, his tail wagging as he sought attention. It was a quiet testament to Max's resilience, a reminder that even after everything, there was still room for hope, for healing. But then, one afternoon, while they were out back repairing a fence, a car pulled into the driveway. Joe tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the wrench in his toolbox. Every muscle in his body screamed to be alert. The car's headlights cut through the dusk, casting long, ominous shadows. The engine rumbled like a warning, sending a chill down Joe's spine. Max stood rigid, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Joe stepped forward, squinting into the headlights. "Can I help you?" he called, his voice steady despite the knot of unease in his stomach. The driver didn't respond right away. Instead, the engine revved and the vehicle inched closer. The tension thickened, suffocating. Then, Without warning, the truck sped off into the night with a screech of tires, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust. Evan appeared at the door, his face pale. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice shaky. Joe shook his head, eyes scanning the darkness. "I don't know, but we need to be careful." That night, the tension grew unbearable. The usual calm of the shop had been replaced by an air of paranoia, every creak, every shadow carrying weight. Strange vehicles started appearing more often, and Joe noticed unfamiliar faces hanging around town, speaking in hushed tones. It was like a storm was brewing just on the horizon, and they were caught in the center of it. Hours later, Joe's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his pulse quickening as he read Rachel's text. The raid was a success. Alan's in custody. Joe exhaled, the weight of the last few weeks lifting off his shoulders. He looked at Evan, showing him the message. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice filled with relief. Evan's shoulders slumped, the tension draining from him as he allowed himself to smile, a real smile, for the first time in weeks. Max barked softly, as if sensing the victory. Joe knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "We did it, buddy. You're safe now." But as Joe looked out into the night, that gnawing feeling returned. Alan was behind bars, yes, but the scars he had left, on Max, on Evan, and on countless others, would take time to heal. Joe was determined to help them every step of the way. Unfortunately, the relief that came with Alan's arrest was short-lived. While the town celebrated the takedown of a notorious criminal, others, Alan's associates, weren't as pleased. Whispers of retaliation reached Joe's ears, carried by worried neighbors and clients who had overheard conversations in local bars. One evening, as Joe and Evan were closing up the shop, a truck rolled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the dusk like a harbinger of trouble. The engine rumbled ominously, sending a chill through the air. Max, always vigilant, stood at attention, his low growl resonating in the quiet of the shop. Joe's heart raced as he stepped outside, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Can I help you?" The truck didn't respond immediately. The driver revved the engine once more, the sound deafening in the stillness. And then, with a screech of tires, it sped off, vanishing into the night. Evan appeared at the door, his face pale. "Who was that?" Joe shook his head, his gaze still scanning the empty driveway. "I don't know, but we need to stay alert. Things are far from over." Though the authorities had successfully dismantled Alan's operation, remnants of his network remained active, and they were far from happy about losing their leader. Rachel, ever the voice of reason, urged Joe to report the incidents to the police. "They need to know what's happening," she insisted. "Even if it's just intimidation, it's still illegal." Joe followed her advice, but the response from the authorities was less than reassuring. With Alan behind bars, they believed the danger had passed. "Keep an eye out and let us know if anything serious happens," an officer told him, their tone dismissive. It wasn't the reassurance Joe had hoped for. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the situation began to bear down on everyone. Evan's anxiety resurfaced, and he started avoiding the outdoors altogether. Max, sensing the unease in the house, became more protective, following Joe and Evan like a silent sentinel wherever they went. Then, one night, the simmering tension finally boiled over. Joe was jerked awake by Max's frantic barking. His heart slammed into his ribs as he bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight and racing for the back door. Evan appeared moments later, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Evan whispered, his voice tight with panic. Before Joe could respond, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass ripped through the night. A brick had crashed through one of the windows, and a flicker of fire danced in its wake. "They're trying to burn us out," Joe realized, his stomach churning. His thoughts were a blur, adrenaline surging. "Call 911, he ordered, his voice sharp. Max, already at the broken window, barked furiously at the retreating figures vanishing into the darkness. Joe grabbed the fire extinguisher, his hands shaking, and doused the flames quickly. The damage was done, though. The message was loud and clear. When the authorities arrived, there was little evidence left behind. The incident was officially labeled as vandalism, but Joe knew it wasn't just that. It was a warning, a reminder that Alan's arrest hadn't wiped out the threat. They were still targets. Evan, visibly shaken, trembled as Joe tried to comfort him. "We'll get through this," Joe promised, though his own words felt weak. Max, sensing Evan's distress, pressed close, offering what little comfort he could. The next day, Rachel arrived with urgent news. "Alan's been talking," she said, her expression grim. "He's trying to cut a deal, but it's stirring up trouble. Some of the people he's naming are dangerous." Joe's frustration flared. "So we're still not safe?" "Not yet," Rachel admitted, her voice tight with concern. "But his testimony could take down the entire network. We just need to hold on a little longer." The knowledge that law enforcement was targeting Alan's associates provided some comfort, but it also raised the stakes. Joe knew they couldn't afford another close call, not with Evan's safety hanging in the balance. Determined to regain control, Joe fortified the shop. He installed security cameras, reinforced doors and windows, and kept a constant vigil over the surrounding area. Max remained ever vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning for danger, his presence a constant reminder that they weren't alone. But even with all the precautions, Joe knew they couldn't live in fear forever. He began reaching out to the community, rallying support for stricter animal cruelty laws and measures against illegal operations. The story of Max's rescue and the fight against Alan's network resonated deeply with many, sparking a movement of activism that brought a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. But the fight wasn't over yet. As the trial date for Alan approached, Joe's nerves were stretched thin. The life he'd built around the shop, the fragile semblance of safety, felt like it was teetering on the edge, about to collapse. Each passing day felt like a countdown to disaster. Evan tried to stay focused on helping around the shop, but his anxiety was palpable. His frequent glances at the windows and doors, his jumpy movements, betrayed his unease. Max, always by his side, seemed to share the same sense of dread, often growling at even the faintest sound. One evening, Rachel called with news that would change everything. "Joe," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I just found out. Alan's associates are planning something big. They're desperate. They might be targeting you to send a message." Joe's grip on the phone tightened. "Do we know when or how?" "Not yet," Rachel replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "But I've flagged it with the police. They're on high alert." Joe hung up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. Evan's safety, Max's well-being, they all depended on his next move. He knew he couldn't wait for another close call. It was time to act. He immediately began fortifying the shop even further, reinforcing every door and window, ensuring every corner was covered. He briefed Evan on an emergency plan, his voice steady but urgent. "If anything happens," Joe said, locking eyes with Evan, "you take Max and head to the shelter by the woods. It's hidden. They won't find you there." Evan nodded, his face pale with fear. "What about you?" "I'll handle whatever comes," Joe replied, determination hardening his features. The following night, the confrontation finally came. Joe was jolted from a restless sleep by the sound of car engines rumbling outside. He shot upright, his heart hammering as he peeked through the blinds. 3 trucks had pulled into the driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Shadows moved swiftly as men climbed out, their postures tense, their intentions clear. Joe didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed Rachel in a low, urgent whisper. "They're here." "I'm sending the police now." Rachel's voice crackled through the phone, sharp with concern. "Do not engage them." Joe hung up, turning to Evan, who was already gripping Max's leash tightly. "Go," Joe urged. "Now." Evan hesitated for just a heartbeat, but then he bolted toward the back door, Max in tow. They disappeared into the night. Joe locked the door behind them, his pulse pounding in his ears as he steeled himself for what was about to unfold. The men approached the shop, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, a heavy presence in the night. One of them, a burly figure with a scar running down his cheek, banged his fist against the door. "We know you're in there, Joe," he called out, his voice grating. "Let's have a chat." Joe's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're trespassing," he called back. "The police are on their way." The scarred man chuckled, a low, menacing sound that made Joe's skin crawl. "Oh, we're not planning to stick around that long. Just thought we'd remind you what happens when you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Before Joe could respond, one of the men smashed a window with a crowbar, sending shards of glass crashing to the floor. Another began prying at the reinforced door, testing its strength. Joe retreated into the shop, his mind working quickly, calculating his next move. Meanwhile, Max, hidden with Evan in the shelter, growled softly, sensing the danger his owner was in. Evan held him close, whispering, "Stay quiet. Max, Joe's counting on us." Back at the shop, Joe made a snap decision. He grabbed the flare gun from his emergency supplies and fired it through the broken window. The bright flare shot into the night with a deafening crack, startling the intruders and buying Joe precious seconds. He dialed Rachel again, his voice tight with urgency. "They're breaking in," Joe gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "How far off are the police?" Rachel's voice crackled through the phone, her concern clear. "They're close," Rachel reassured him, though Joe could hear the tension in her voice. "Just hold on a little longer." But the intruders, now regaining their composure, weren't backing down. The scarred man kicked down the damaged door, his sneer widening as he stepped inside. "End of the line, Joe." But Joe wasn't alone. Max, his instincts driving him, had broken free from Evan's hold and raced back toward the shop. The dog burst through the side entrance, barking ferociously, his presence momentarily halting the intruders in their tracks. "Max!" Joe shouted, heart racing, terrified for the dog's safety, but Max wasn't afraid. He launched himself at the nearest intruder, knocking the man to the ground with the force of his impact. The commotion threw the other men off balance, just as the unmistakable sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The scarred man cursed under his breath and signaled his crew to retreat. "This isn't over," he snarled, glaring at Joe one last time before disappearing into the night. Within moments, the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the chaos. Officers quickly secured the area, starting to take statements as they processed the scene. Rachel arrived soon after, her face a mix of relief and anger. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, pulling Joe into a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. Joe glanced over at Max, who was being checked over by an officer. "I owe him my life," he said softly, his voice full of awe and gratitude. As the adrenaline began to ebb, Joe realized one thing. The confrontation had only solidified his resolve. The intruders may have been driven off for now, but this wasn't over. He couldn't let Alan's associates continue to wreak havoc. With Rachel's support, Joe swore to see the case through to its final conclusion, not just for his own peace of mind, but for all the victims of Alan's cruelty. The attack had rattled Joe, but it hadn't broken him. The stakes had changed. The assault on his shop wasn't merely an attempt to intimidate, it was a declaration of war. As dawn broke over the quiet town, Joe knew the battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting everything he held dear and standing against the cruelty that had plagued so many lives. In the days that followed, there was a renewed sense of hope. Children played with Max in the yard, their laughter echoing across the property. For the first time in weeks, Joe felt something he hadn't dared to allow himself: peace. "We did it," Joe said, his eyes meeting Evan's. "We turned something terrible into something good." Evan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Max did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "He saved us." Joe looked down at Max, who was now lying in the grass, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog had been through so much, yet his spirit remained unbroken. And in that moment, Joe realized that Max wasn't just a survivor, he was a hero. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden glow, Joe knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "You're a good boy, Max," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. "The best." Max wagged his tail, his loyalty shining brightly in his eyes. There was no need for words, only the quiet, unspoken bond between them, a promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The weeks following the raid brought a sense of renewal to Joe's life. Though the scars of that night were still fresh, they served as a reminder of the strength he had found in himself and the people around him. The community rallied behind the shop, transforming it into a beacon of hope, a place where second chances weren't just given, but celebrated. The shop, now affectionately called Max's Haven, became a local landmark. People from surrounding towns came not only to adopt animals, but to hear the incredible story of Max's bravery and resilience. Max, the once abused dog, had become a symbol of courage and loyalty. His story inspired countless others to stand up against animal cruelty and injustice. Joe's bond with Max grew deeper in ways he hadn't imagined. Every morning, Max would accompany him on walks around the property, his tail wagging excitedly. The dog, who had once been anxious and afraid, now exuded confidence and joy, his playful antics bringing a smile to everyone who visited. Evan, too, found healing in Max's presence. The boy, who had once been too afraid to trust the world, now worked tirelessly alongside Joe, caring for the animals and greeting visitors with a newfound sense of purpose. One afternoon, Rachel visited the shop, her eyes reflecting the pride she felt in what they had accomplished. "You've turned this place into something incredible," she said, looking around at the bustling activity. Volunteers cleaned enclosures, children played with the animals, and a new family left with a rescued dog, their faces glowing with excitement. Joe nodded, his gaze following Max as he ran through the yard with a group of children. "It's all thanks to him," Joe said, his voice soft but full of admiration. "Max taught us what it means to fight for something worth saving." Rachel's expression softened. "You gave him that chance, Joe. And now, look at all the lives he's touched." As they spoke, a woman approached with her daughter, holding a donation envelope. "We heard Max's story," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It gave us the courage to leave a bad situation. Thank you for what you're doing here." Joe accepted the envelope, humbled by her words. In moments like these, he was reminded of why he'd started this journey, to create a safe haven for those who needed it most. Beyond the shop, The ripple effect of their efforts continued to spread. Alan's testimony had led to the dismantling of multiple animal trafficking rings, and new legislation was being proposed to strengthen protections against cruelty. Rachel, now an influential advocate for these changes, used Max's story during public hearings, rallying others to take a stand for justice. But for Joe, the true reward was always closer to home. On a quiet evening, as the sun set over the town, he sat on the porch with Max at his feet and Evan by his side. The golden light bathed the yard, and the laughter of children playing echoed in the distance. It was a moment of peace, one that reminded him that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail. Joe's voice broke the silence. "Do you think Max remembers everything? Like how hard it was before?" Joe looked down at Max, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes. "I think he does," Joe said thoughtfully. "But I also think he chooses to focus on what he has now. He's a survivor, Evan. And survivors don't forget. They grow." Evan nodded, seeming to understand. He reached down to pat Max, who wagged his tail in response. "I want to be like him," Evan said softly. "Strong, brave." Joe smiled, ruffling Evan's hair. "You already are." As night fell, Joe carried the memory of that day with him, a quiet affirmation that they were on the right path. The journey had been long, the road ahead uncertain, but together with Max leading the way, they would face whatever came next. The following morning, Joe awoke to find Max sitting by the door, his leash in his mouth, his eyes gleaming with excitement. It was as if the dog were asking, "What's next?" Joe laughed, grabbing the leash and opening the door. "Let's find out, buddy." And as they stepped into the fresh morning air, Joe felt a renewed sense of purpose. Max had been given a second chance, and in turn, he had given Joe, and everyone around them, a reason to believe in the power of hope, resilience, and unconditional love. Did Max's journey touch your heart? How do you believe animals express their love and loyalty? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want more, be sure to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. Let's continue working together to create a better world for animals and their companions. See you in the next video.